Remote sensing is just so cool to me. It's like the stuff of science fiction. It's like Star Trek, scan the planet for life forms from your starship kind of thing. And the beautiful thing is, satellites don't lie. They're capturing what's actually happening on the ground, which governments can't spin or hide.
So, journalists have been increasingly using satellite imagery and remote sensing technology to report on environmental crime and human rights abuses. It's also become an essential tool in recording the scale of war damage in places like Gaza and Ukraine. More and more, these methods are being used to answer reporting questions at scale, helping us journalists understand how widespread a given problem is in hard to reach areas. So, working with partners across Southeast Asia, some of our Lighthouse team has been hard at work on a series of investigations which uses remote sensing technology to map out deforestation. Over the coming year, we will be investigating the scale of deforestation in the Philippines, Indonesia, Myanmar, Malaysia, and Vietnam, and identifying how commodities that have replaced these trees are being laundered into global supply chains. If you're not sure exactly what remote sensing is, you're not alone. So before we go any further, Tessa, when you hear the word remote sensing, what do you think of?
Okay, so this is slightly embarrassing, but when I first heard the term, what immediately popped into my head was those garden sprinklers that are on people's front yards that kind of turn on when intruders cross them. I think it's something I've seen in a movie, and I'm not quite sure why if this comes into my head, but I guess maybe because they're sensors and they're activated remotely.
I knew you'd have a good answer to that, Tessa. So this month, we'll be digging exactly into what remote sensing is and useful ways that journalists can incorporate it into their own work. So the voice you heard at the start of the episode is of Min Lwin, a data journalist at TB, which is a data studio that works on storytelling. And we're going to be speaking to him and Lucelle Bonzo, the executive director of Davao Today, a Philippines news outlet. They're going to be walking us through the methods behind the first installment of this series, which is called Forest Fraud. And essentially, this is a story that reveals how a government effort in the Philippines, considered one of the world's most ambitious regreening programs, which was designed to basically preserve rainforest and promote sustainable agriculture, actually failed to do both. It reveals how sites that were meant to be used for reforestation were cleared, and communities were instead forced to grow cash crops. So these are crops that are grown mainly to be sold and exported rather than being used by the farmers who grew them, and they offer very little economic benefits. So ultimately, they found that many of these so-called protected areas had actually no trees at all.
Yeah, and at Lighthouse, we've been exploring different ways to experiment with remote sensing analysis for a while. But this story is super important because the global community is actually putting a lot of pressure on countries with a lot of natural rainforests, like Southeast Asian countries, to do more to protect those rainforests. But simultaneously, they're importing billions of dollars of commodities from agricultural land that was once that pristine rainforest. And it's also very timely because deforestation is going to be a central discussion at the upcoming COP30 in Brazil, as you can imagine, because there's a lot of rainforest there. And there's also an upcoming implementation of an EU regulation on deforestation, which basically proposes to ban any products coming from deforested zones.
And we should mention that at the center of the story, which was initiated by Lucelle, is the island of Palawan. And this is a beautiful place that honestly I had never heard of before. And when I Googled it, I was like, wow, these images look unreal. I also read that one of the beaches in Palawan has been named the #1 beach in Asia and #2 in the world, in a ranking of the world's 50 best beaches. And yes, this exists, and I have no idea who judges it.
Well, it sounds very beautiful, but coming from Australia, I am very picky about beaches. So, Beatriz, where did you find this information?
It's literally a website called worlds50beaches.com. I'm sorry, it sounds very legit. And I have to tell you, Australia ranks only number 11.
Okay, so clearly absolutely not credible, but yes, I believe that Palawan is actually very well known for its beaches. And it's also known for being the kind of last ecological frontier of the Philippines. So I did some research on Palawan as well, and it's made up predominantly of rainforest, mangrove forest, and as you mentioned, many stunning pristine beaches. And it's home to several indigenous communities who live in the mountain and coastal areas of Palawan. So sadly, it's now one of the places experiencing the most deforestation pressure. And I think the story is a great example of how journalists can merge innovative methods with community reporting, as Lucelle went to report this story out in Palawan, to demand government accountability.
So, we're going to be hearing from Lumen first and how he reported out the remote sensing aspect of the story. And later on in the episode, we're going to be hearing from Lucelle and her work speaking to local communities affected by deforestation. So, let's get into it.
From Lighthouse Reports, this is Backlight, a monthly deep dive into the world of collaborative investigations.
We're your hosts, impact editor Tessa Pang
and investigative reporter Beatriz Ramalho de Silva.
It's been a year and a half now, way longer than we expected. This started as maybe a 2-3 month project and turned into this massive investigation into how the Philippines' $1 billion reforestation program was actually being used as cover to clear native forests and replace them with monoculture cash crops. So my colleague Lucelle, she runs Davao Today, this online daily news magazine based in the south of the Philippines. She was working on this as her capstone project for the Environmental Data Journalism Academy. That's a program that we run at DB together with Earth Journalism Network. So Lucelle found this government portal with all these reforestation sites mapped out, but nobody could figure out how to actually download the data. And I remember seeing the post about the map in our group chat and thinking, let's give this a shot. I rummaged around, dug around the website, and managed to scrape all 130,000 sites, all these site maps. And I shared it with the team, and that's the moment that I was basically roped into the project. So that data, together with a global remote sensing dataset, are the key puzzle pieces that let us go from here are examples of wrongdoing to here's the pattern like nationwide. And what we found was shocking. Like 1 in every 25 hectares of these reforestation sites actually lost forest cover after being declared reforestation sites. That's a no-no, right? And we found widespread monocropping, areas that are still barren nearly a decade into the program, and communities just left behind by these complicated registration processes for tenure. But here we are, more than a year later, still going strong and working on part 2 as we speak.
So Lumen, Lucelle, and the Lighthouse team are currently hard at work on part 2 and part 3 of this story. So the first thing we asked Lumen was, what is remote sensing? Because quite frankly, as you could glean from the episode, I do not fully understand how this works.
Remote sensing is just so cool to me. It's like the stuff of science fiction. It's like Star Trek, scan the planet for life forms from your starship kind of thing. And the beautiful thing is, satellites don't lie. They're capturing what's actually happening on the ground, which governments can't spin or hide. Remote sensing is when we try to, remotely sense or sense from far away from where the satellites are, what's going on the ground. So these satellites are taking lots of pictures of the Earth, not just visible light, but also invisible electromagnetic radiation, which gives us a lot of data to infer what's going on the Earth. Like, forest loss, or even the height of trees, or the development of cities, or where fires are raging. And there's guesswork involved, right? Because you have these images. How do you get from just satellite images to here's forests, here's settlements, here's fires? That's where machine learning comes in. These algorithms are trained on field observations, expert input to pick up these things, and then infer these things from millions of satellites images. And how do you access the data? There's lots of platforms for you to work with remote sensing data or even just raw satellite images. Global Forest Watch is a great place to get started because you can cut, slice, and visualize forest loss data.
This is very impressive. The team used machine learning tools to analyze millions of satellite images to detect deforestation across over 100,000 NGP sites. And for context, NGP is the name given to the government regreening program. So these tools are quite accessible from what Lumen told us and basically just out there for people to experiment with. I guess the key question is knowing when this will be the right method for an investigation.
Yeah, and actually, recently there's been a lot of great work in the investigative space that has used remote sensing to uncover hidden abuses. And I can think of a few recent examples. There was a Reuters investigation that showed the scale of famine in Sudan and counted how many people had died by doing a remote sensing analysis of graves. And even more recently, news outlets like The Guardian have used remote sensing analysis to reveal the mass destruction left behind by the war in Gaza. And some of this journalistic work has actually gone on to be quoted, for example, in things like UN reports. Lumen had a few thoughts on how remote sensing is being used by journalists, and it did involve a Starship anecdote, which I loved.
So let's go back to our starship, and we're scanning this planet, right? First off, we're scanning a whole planet. That's great coverage, and that's why we use remote sensing. And we've had satellites for many decades now. So we have historical observations, we can monitor trends, and finally, it's just so much more efficient to scan from your starship than to be doing field visits to every site, every continent. And you just sit on your starship, you do the scan, and you get a sense of what's going on across the planet. In terms of real world contexts, we would use remote sensing to monitor the environment, to monitor changes in forests, monitor water resources like lakes, rivers, groundwater, even, and monitor crops. Disaster management is a great use case. You can map flood risk, fires, do post disaster like damage evaluations. Urban planning, you can track the growth of cities. And for investigative journalists, this is powerful because you can fact check government claims about environmental programs, disaster response, for example.
As always, we do have a write up for our methodology on our website, but I have to say, I did prefer Lumen's explanation on how he used remote sensing to unveil the data.
Yeah, completely agree. And for me, understanding exactly what remote sensing is helps me to understand the impact of the results and how it kind of fills gaps that exist in the current data and how it could, for example, help improve policies like the National Greening Program in the Philippines.
Let me get into the weeds a little bit here. So there's really two parts to this. The first part is the maps of 130,000 reforestation sites from the Philippines government portal. And the second part is global forest change data. It's remote sensing data set, which comes out of the University of Maryland and captures annual forest changes from 2001 to 2024 now. So we essentially looked at how much forest loss was happening in each reforestation site, and we kind of filtered it out to the years after, or even around when each site was established. So, that's when really no forest loss should be happening. We did this with Google Earth Engine. Like I mentioned, it's a great tool because you can load up the global forest change data set in one line of code, and you can bring in the site maps, and you can kind of like put them on top of each other and get the forest loss statistic for each and every site. The machine learning was integral to how we go from satellite images to here's forest lost. We need a way to tell, after looking at the pixels of the satellite image and maybe comparing it across time, whether forest loss occurred in this pixel. And the way you do it is you get lots of ground truth data. Maybe you have experts looking through high resolution images and manually annotating stuff. Essentially, you use all of this training data to teach a computer how to do the identification themselves. So, back to our story. We have forest loss figures for each site after they were established as reforestation sites. We then look at which places are the most affected, which let us hone in on where to focus our ground reporting. Of course, we have whistleblowers alarming us to certain sites, certain places. So we looked at the data around these sites where illegal forest clearings were reported to come up with concrete evidence for accountability.
The key thing here is a story like this couldn't really be done without remote sensing. It unlocks the possibility of accessing evidence on a massive scale that really wouldn't be feasible to do through traditional reporting methods. Even traveling across these regions has its own security concerns and costs that are just not feasible for most journalists.
So, we mentioned how accessible these methods are and how remote sensing can sort of be this like life saving ingredient for investigations that are trying to tackle hard to reach remote places. But it's not all roses, and there is not necessarily a one size fits all. So, Lumen shared a few of the obstacles that he's faced.
This is juicy because there are lots of challenges. I have worked with geospatial data before, but never at such large scales and never with Google Earth Engine, actually. I learned Google Earth Engine from scratch just for this project. So I would say the code is not the hardest part. The hardest part is actually understanding the ins and outs of the dataset that you're working with and understanding what it can tell you and what it can't tell you. For instance, in global forest change, it's not actually quantifying deforestation, it's quantifying forest loss. And there's a subtle difference between these two, where deforestation is permanent, but forest loss could cover things like forest loss due to fires. And, fires are an integral natural part of some forest ecosystems, and these forests routinely recover from fires. So, subtle difference and lots of other things where, like do palm oil trees count as trees? What's the minimum height? What's the threshold for tree cover?
But what is really great from how Lumen describes this is obviously remote sensing is not a straightforward methodology. It requires people to like play around with data sets and often think of innovative ways that this method can help solve for the answers in their investigation.
Yeah, but hopefully this episode inspires some people to think about how remote sensing could be used in projects to provide more validity or more data evidence to back up their findings. And Lumen shared some tips for journalists who want to do exactly that and get started in remote sensing too.
For satellite images, Google Earth Pro is a great desktop app that lets you look at satellite imagery. Sentinel Hub is another great place to look at imagery, especially if you're concerned about what's going on over time. Global Forest Watch is a great place to start. They have a great dashboard where you can select the country, even the state, the province, the municipality, and get all these statistics about forests in one go. But if you really want to dive into the data and you code a little bit, you can use cloud tools like Google Earth Engine. There's a bit of a learning curve, at least for me, but I had so much fun playing around with the data and finally getting to these insights that help the rest of the investigation team move forward. That was like super rewarding for me after, hours of pulling my hair out trying to figure out what this code does. And the key is that satellite data gives you one more layer of evidence to fact check government claims, like companies' claims. In our case, we could show that we could show the government like exact coordinates where forest loss was recorded after the sites were declared for reforestation. In the case of our whistleblowers, we could show that the area they flagged for illegal forest clearings indeed experienced forest loss and even, come up with satellite imagery to indicate like clearing patterns in the site that they were talking about.
You're listening to Backlight, Lighthouse Report's monthly deep dive into the world of investigative journalism. If you want to hear more about our investigations, you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. Or if you have a suggestion about a topic we can talk about or a person we can talk to on this podcast, you can reach out to us at backlight@lighthousereports.com. We're back. Backlight is a monthly deep dive bringing you inside the world of investigative journalism. This week, we're hearing from two journalists about their work using remote sensing to investigate deforestation in the Philippines.
So pero yung sa bilihan ng seedlings, involved po 'di ba yung ang isang na-interview namin sa seedlings nagkakaproblema yung PO.
This is Lucelle, the executive director of Davao Today. And what you just heard is some of the audio from her trip to Palawan, where she spoke to people affected by the deforestation that Min described using remote sensing to map out. She told us that she'd been a bit hesitant about this project initially. She'd never worked on a data journalism project before, and reporting on a story that pokes holes in a government program is never really without any risks.
So that got me thinking, what does deforestation look like in the Philippines? I remembered that I have read several reports about the National Greening Program, how it had a huge budget but falls short from its targets. Some articles pointed out that the use of exotic species, poorly planned sites, and reforestation areas that remain barren. That's when I decided to dig deeper and see if data could help verify what was really going on behind those headlines. For me, deforestation is not simply cutting down the trees, but it is really the destruction of the whole biodiversity that are present in it.
So Lucelle told us that one of the key issues with the National Greening Program, the program that claimed to be protecting forests, is how, even though it said it was meant to give farmers and local communities more autonomy over what was being planted in regreening sites, ultimately it kind of pushed farmers to plant this fast-growing exotic tree species called falcata. And for several days, Lucelle met para enforcers. This is the name given to the network of people monitoring the forests, who told her that they had seen large-scale slash and burn and commercial farming in the NGP sites. And slash and burn is this technique where forest land is basically really quickly cleared and any remaining vegetation is burnt. She also said that often native trees, which should have been in the protected areas, were just completely missing.
So falcata is a fast-growing exotic tree species. There was a farmer who told me that back in 2011, they were very hopeful and aggressive in planting falcata because they envision that they will get rich from planting it when they harvest it after 8 to 10 years, because at that time the prices of falcata were high in the market. But by 2024, things had flipped, prices had plummeted, the demand in the market, I think it has dried up. But the effort they poured into planting and maintaining these trees, I think they felt that they had wasted.
A key part of Lucelle's work on the ground was also trying to verify the data that Min had collected. She also worked to track down sources inside the government department who were able to tell her what patterns of greenwashing to look out for.
So I think what struck me most across all the conversations that I had was the gap between the program's official narrative, because as when you look at their websites, the results are, I think, 100% success and people's lived realities and experiences in implementing the NGP. So they have been trying to hide the problems and the challenges of the NGP implementation. So I think journalists like us should report things like this because it is the reality on the ground that I think best describes how the program is implemented and was implemented. I think for the past because the NGP started in 2011.
So, Tessa, we've gone through half the episode without actually mentioning that you've been working on this story for the past few months too. You've been mapping out the impact side of things as we prepare to launch this full blown series of stories. Can you share with us some insider thoughts?
Yeah, so Lucelle's project had pretty much wrapped up by the time I came on board. I've been working with the team on how we can get those findings to, for example, academics, policymakers, and affected communities in the Philippines ahead of a part 2 and part 3 that will come out later this year. And I've also been working with the team on the rest of the series that will come out in Malaysia, Indonesia, Myanmar, and Vietnam either later this year or earlier next year as well. And what has struck me particularly about the Philippines part of the story is that the NGP is a project that has genuine intentions to regreen protected areas. And it's strange how it kind of just went so wrong in the implementation. And also, what's been really interesting is how the combination of ground reporting and data reporting just leads to indisputable evidence about the ways that the project went wrong.
I mean, when I was reading the pieces, it was really interesting to hear how, when they contacted the architect of this program, who's a professor at the University of Philippines, he actually conceded that things had not gone as planned and that actually they had no adequate monitoring mechanisms in place. So this investigation, it was like the first time any sort of monitoring had been done of this program, which is pretty amazing. So we asked Lucelle what her thoughts were on what she hopes to achieve with this reporting too.
It's a question of accountability also for the government because the project involves a huge budget. I think Filipino taxpayers deserve to know if this program is really working because I think after reports released in 2019 by the Commission on Audit, I haven't found official audits after that. So I think accountability would be first. Second, I hope that it would spark community driven reforestation. Communities and people's organizations and civic society groups would unite or would lead them to think of comprehensive or a holistic form of reforestation that is simply not equating to tree planting only. One impact that I hope that this reporting brings is that journalists would continue to pursue environmental stories and treat them not just science or policy beats, but also justice and human rights story because it involves people's lives. Deforestation involves everybody. So I think that's the impact that I foresee in the reporting.
We went back to Lumin with the same question and asked him what outcomes he hoped this reporting would achieve.
So, very recently, Global Forest Change published their 2024 data. And in one of their launch webinars, Med Hansen, the professor who leads the lab producing Global Forest Change, said something that really stuck with me, which is along the lines of we can get better at monitoring these things, we can get better and better tools, but the data that we have now is enough of a wake up call. Like, we know how bad it is already, and better tools are just gonna tell us how much worse it is, maybe. What's urgent is not better reporting. We still need better reporting, but what's urgent is how we as a society and how governments respond to these threats to our shared planet. For this investigation, for me, I wanted to show that the use of remote sensing data can be accessible, can be applied to the Southeast Asian context. I'm from Myanmar. And because reforestation sites are not just unique to the Philippines, journalists, data people, academics, we can all work together to achieve shared outcomes.
That feels like a great place to end. I really enjoyed hearing from Lumin and how he explained that remote sensing can be this very accessible methodology with so many possibilities for reporting. And I will now immediately think of starships when I think of remote sensing. But in all seriousness, particularly when it comes to environmental investigations, we're witnessing alarming levels of deforestation across the world. So it's really an advantage that more and more reporters try to experiment with this methodology as a way to hold governments to account. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, this is a method that is not limited at all to environmental reporting. It has many, many different use cases.
Yeah, and I hope it made remote sensing more accessible to people and helped them understand how they can incorporate it as another dimension of evidence for their investigations. I'm also really excited to see how it works out for the rest of this project that we have coming out later this year.
Yes, lots of great work ahead. Thank you so much to Lucelle and Lumin for speaking to us. You can find the links to the reporting on the Lighthouse Reports website, and there will be all the links to the pieces from both Devout Today and TB, our partners who worked with us on this story. And stay tuned for our follow-up investigations.
To keep up to date with our work, you can follow us on our social media. We have Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and Blue Sky. Our handles are @LH Reports. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. And all of those are linked in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please send it to a friend. It really helps others to find the show.
This episode was produced and hosted by Tessa Pang and Beatriz Ramalho Silva. It was sound edited and designed by Spoovio. Thanks for listening, everyone.